All right, welcome to the podcast, episode 7 of the Noel Casler podcast. I'm back here with my executive producer, Jimmy Kennedy. It's been a heck of a week. There's a lot to talk about, so let's get right into it. How you doing, Jimmy?
Oh, kind of a rough day today, Noel. We had a mass shooting happen in Indianapolis, and it hits a little different when it's your own city. But there's nobody I would rather be talking to about it than you right now. So thanks for having me.
Well, thank you, brother. My sympathies to everybody in the Indianapolis area. And, it's an epidemic. It's happening everywhere. And if it hasn't happened to you, sadly, odds are it might. It might happen in your city. And that's the problem. We have to stop this immediately. It's been an epidemic for 20 years. I'm a half an hour from Sandy Hook right now. I know what that feels like. And it wasn't just a mass shooting. I mean, it was 8 people were killed. Another 5 people were sent to the hospital. That's 13 lives, that are affected. That's 13 families that are living through an ungodly hell tonight. And sadly, it wasn't even in the news by noon. I woke up to the news of it, and there was a graphic of how many shootings there's been in the last month, but then it sort of disappeared. Not that people are numb to it, we're just getting overwhelmed, and we can't. We have to do something about this. It's probably the most critical issue facing our country right now, besides the pandemic and the corruption of the GOP.
Yeah, without a doubt. Joe Biden as well as Governor Holcomb announced that they're going to keep flags at half staff. My argument would be just keep them at half staff and raise the flag when something awesome happens, because at this point it's happening on a daily basis.
Absolutely. They're perpetually half staffed. 2 Fridays ago, a Capitol police officer was killed by somebody, ironically, from Indiana, too. What do you guys got going on there in
I don't
Indiana?
know. I called on Ron Klain and Pete Buttigieg to speak out against the violence. They're the best that Indiana has to offer right now. So, and they're showing that leadership. And day by day, we'll try to improve the situation.
Absolutely. Well, my prayers are with all those people out there, and I know what you're going through. And nobody should have to go through that. Unfortunately, many people have to go through it now all the time. And it's just, it's disgusting. And it's been an overwhelming week. That shooting came on the heels of a nation basically being traumatized again with the trial of George Floyd, most specifically the African Americans in our country that have to watch his murder over and over if they're paying attention to the trial. And how can you not? Then, while that's going on, we had the case last weekend of the Army lieutenant who got, pulled over in December and pepper sprayed and harassed and brutalized, by a couple of cops in uniform. The guy's a lieutenant in the Army, and he's getting treated with like a lack of respect that you would hope they wouldn't treat their enemies with in war, And then we got then we got Wisconsin again. 20 minutes from where the trial of George Floyd is going on, another young man is killed for having an air freshener on his car and an outstanding warrant for like not getting mail properly, like paying a fine,
Mm-hmm.
And if you noticed, I know you did because we shared the thing back and forth, but there was another guy in Wisconsin, a white guy, who rammed his car into 2 police cars that were trying to stop him. A police officer climbed on this dude's pickup truck. The dude drove off with the cop on the car, and they didn't shoot him. They somehow found reason not to even shoot at this guy's tires when he's got a cop on his car and he's speeding away. Guess what? He was a white suspect.
Yeah, I mean, and going back to your point about that military officer that was harassed by law enforcement, remember when Colin Kaepernick was kneeling and they said that was disrespecting our veterans and the flag? What's really more disrespectful, Colin Kaepernick kneeling and doing a peaceful protest in the name of police brutality, which is still going on, or what happened to that soldier? It's just, man, I mean, it's becoming more clear by the day. It's a travesty what's going on. And if you allow me to make one more point, one thing that I'm proud of when it comes to Save Indiana is the way that we handle our Amber Alerts. That's when a kid is kidnapped or believed to be in danger. the rest of the country models their procedure after the state of Indiana with how well our retention rate is. One of the reasons why that works is because we don't send out a lot of Amber Alerts. these shootings are happening at such a rate that we are becoming desensitized to it. It's becoming routine, and it's disgusting that that's even being allowed.
I know. Well, people
Yeah.
accept it. We did a
Yeah.
special episode with a police officer, a friend of mine who does active shooter training for law enforcement in schools out in California. And that'll be available to our listeners if you want to check it out. It's going to be on YouTube. But he talked about how they hire actors and former law enforcement guys like him to tell people sort of how to react in these training situations if a shooter comes to your campus. And that's mind-boggling for somebody of my generation, that these little kids in elementary school have to practice active shooter drills. It's just insane that we've accepted it. It should have never happened. And the cynicism of it, you mentioned Colin Kaepernick. Nobody was actually offended at him taking a knee. They were offended that a person of color would ask for his human rights, would get involved, because they're basically like, hey, you're a gladiator, bro. We're sitting here to watch you get your ass kicked on Sunday afternoon. We don't want to hear anything out of you. It's like you hear people say about artists, like I used to work with Springsteen. I love Springsteen, and people are like, I wish he would just play his songs and not give his political opinion. Really? You want an artist not to give his opinion? Because I'll tell you something, all art is political. Everybody's coming at it from a point of view of humanity. And you're writing about the things that affect you. And like, have you ever heard Springsteen? Like he's been documenting what happens his whole career, and especially what happens when cynical, wealthy people try to manipulate the masses and the working class and sort of divide them. So that's what the NFL thing was. Fox News was started by Rupert Murdoch, who basically wanted a piece of that NASCAR NFL demographic. He was looking for his next big investment, and he's like, man, there's all these white rural people in America who spend a ton of money on NASCAR and NFL and stuff, and they're not really that politically sophisticated or savvy. They may pay attention to local politics, but like they're not tuning into CNN. What can I draw them in with? And they invented Fox News because he's like, let me just make it all like this class sort of white black issue. And let me get them all ginned up on racism and socialism and all this stuff. And it took off like wildfire, and it made a fortune. But it manipulated a bunch of people. And unfortunately, now it's been going on for a couple generations. So people are indoctrinated in that, and we look at what happened, Kalimnik, we learned, this is going to be a weird tangent to go off, but it's the same thing. There was proof given yesterday that Konstantin Kalimnik took the polling data and the internal data from the Trump campaign and delivered it to the Russians in the 2016 election, right? Anybody with a brain knew that's what was going down. That's what Jared and all these guys were up to the whole time. That's what Paul Manafort was brought in to do, right? Paul arranged all that. So Paul's already been pardoned, from doing that. And Trump had 4 years to say a Russia hoax, a Russia collusion. There is no collusion. It's a Russia hoax. It's a Russia hoax. So what do you think those people on Fox News, when they got this definitive proof yesterday that they did in fact interfere in the 2016 election, which means Trump wasn't legitimately elected? That's basically what that means, is that you had a president serve for 4 years who did so with the aid of a foreign power, and not only a foreign power, but our greatest traditional adversary ever. How many wars did we fight because Russia was involved by proxy? That's what Vietnam was about. That's what Korea was about. That's what American imperialism in Central America was about. It was always the Red Scare. If we don't stop them there, they're going to be on your doorstep. So the fact that the Republican Party acquiesced so quickly to take this Russian influence says everything about that party that already doesn't have any morals. And what it says to me is they were terrified of Hillary Clinton, that they knew that they would not win without the Russian help, that they took the Russian help, and they knew they would ultimately get busted for taking that help. But what was more important to them was to control the narrative in the meantime. And that's what they got to do. He got to say Russia hoax over the helicopter every time he walked out from the White House to go golfing on the weekend. He would just spew this nonsense. But now we see it, right? If you bring this up on social media, on Facebook, to your buddies that, work as contractors now or live in the suburbs and like Trump, they're going to be like, oh, that's BS. There you are, you libtards again with your Russia hoax. That was already proven to be a hoax. No, it wasn't. They just knew that they had to control the narrative. Just like the Mueller report, when it came out, the redacted version, before we even got to read that, Bill Barr had a press conference 6 weeks before we actually got to see the report and said, yeah, I read the report. It completely exonerates Trump. It did not do that, but he was able to put that in the ecosphere, so to speak, and the press regurgitated it. They allowed it. When you give Trump a mouthpiece, that's what a con man really needs. He needs attention. He doesn't need the laws on his side. He doesn't need to get away with the crime. He needs to get your awareness. And he can manipulate that awareness and know that he can turn enough minds in his favor that he can make it very hard for you to catch him or catch up with him. And that's what we see now. He's not in jail. He's living down in Mar-a-Lago. He had a fundraiser last weekend, after he shook down the GOP, attacked the Capitol, tried to kill the vice president. Then in March, told the GOP, you can't use my name or likeness in any fundraising going forward. What did they turn around and do, the GOP, the RNC, the Republican National Committee? They went and had a fundraiser at Mar-a-Lago last Saturday and paid him $100,000 to talk to them,
Well, and he also used the White House as a backdrop in the 2020 election. Like, that's the people's house. You said that in the interview on my show. Like, the guy is completely shameless. And you know what? I think I'm speaking for most Americans. Well, at least the majority to this point, I don't like presidents that collude with foreign nations. Like, we need to have presidents that have American interests at heart. And, part of the issue too was that Mueller said the only thing that kept Trump from being charged was that he was currently the active president. And, you're immune from criminality with that kind of position. So, he might face an entire slew of new criminality with this report coming out.
He might, he won't.
Right. You know him better than I do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In theory, yes, if the public has the will to go after him, but I don't see anything ever happening to that guy. Obviously, he has charges, pending in the New York Attorney General and stuff, but he's not going to pay any price for his crimes. He's 74 years old. He can tie up all of that stuff in the courts for the next 5 years, continue to grift money. He'll get DeSantis to either be his running mate or be the candidate for the RNC in the next presidential election. He'll get a piece of all that fundraising between now and then, and maybe cut a deal with Ron and say, okay, you get to be president. I'll give you my blessing, but I'm getting 2 bits on everything you take in. I'm getting 20% of everything. That's who Trump is. He's a mobster, so he's not going to pay a price. I'm sorry for people who think he is, and believe me, I want him to. And apparently E. Jean Carroll has some news breaking in her case against him. I think he will get in trouble for some of the sex crimes, but that's a civil case. That's not a criminal case. But people thinking he's going to end up in a an orange jumpsuit, like that ain't happening.
Well, and one question that kind of blows my mind, as much as we know about Trump, there's a lot that we don't know. Like, imagine the crimes that we haven't heard about. Wow. with how, rampant he is with sex crimes and the financial links he'll go to have the advantage for himself. There's so much we still don't know about this guy.
Yeah, I know. Well, the people don't want to know about him,
right?
Because you knew it in New York City. James Zirin wrote a book about the 4,000 lawsuits that he'd been involved in civil cases. I think I talked on this show about his helicopter pilot who was a coke dealer. Did I tell you that story?
I don't believe so. I don't remember that one.
Well, he had a helicopter pilot who got busted in the 80s for bringing a bunch of kilos of cocaine from Florida up to Ohio. He got arrested for it. It's a very serious charge in a place like Ohio. They moved the case. It was a federal case. They moved it to New Jersey, to the district that Trump's sister was a federal judge in. She recused herself, but appointed the judge. The judge read a letter aloud in court that was written by Trump saying my helicopter pilot's a good guy. He just made a mistake. He essentially got a slap on the wrist, did a little bit like 13 months in Danbury, got out of prison and bought a condo in Trump Tower, where by happenstance you could easily buy cocaine for the next 20 years, right?
Yeah.
So it was no secret if you knew who Trump was. You know, there was a lot of cocaine being sold in his casinos in Atlantic City. You don't think Trump got a piece of that? You know, on in television, the big story was that he attacked a contestant in Trinidad, and they had to fly him off the island in the middle of the night. I've talked about this a lot on Twitter. So if you were around Trump, you knew he was bad news. He was mobbed up. You know, the police officer that we just had on a special show talked about that. You know, he knew Trump was involved with Fat Tony Salerno. This guy grew up next to where Trump grew up in Queens. You know, people knew who Trump was in New York, which is why he got away with what he got away with, because there was a lot of other people doing shady stuff too. Rudy Giuliani was, you know, a mobbed up kind of guy. It's no coincidence that um, the lawyer, Mark Mukasey, the lawyer now representing Matt Gaetz, is Trump Organization's lawyer and was Rudy Giuliani's lawyer. Okay, that's as mob move as you get. Like, okay, this little squirrel's in trouble. You're going to use my lawyer because I need to know what you're talking, you know, what you're saying to the feds, what they're charging you with, what evidence you have. That's why he has that lawyer. It's a mob move. Trump gets involved in all of that stuff. And he's gotten away. He probably got, you know, when he was a bad seed as a kid, I've talked about it many times. The best analogy about Trump is that he would throw rocks at the neighbor's baby. You know, he was a bad dude. Like there was something wrong with him, like little kids that torture pets and stuff, you know. And instead of paying a price, as I always say, if he'd grown up poor in the Bronx, nature would have taken care of it. Somebody else's father would have beat him down, you know, or he would have gone to jail for his crimes for assaulting a woman or something. But he was rich and his dad sent him to military school. His dad continued to let him fail upwards, right? His dad paid for his grades. You know, he had people take his tests so he could get into Fordham, and he could later transfer from Fordham to Penn and then say he had an Ivy League degree. You know, the guy can't even read. You know, the guy is about the most intellectually stunted person you will ever meet. He likes cheeseburgers and big titties. Like he doesn't have any kind of sophistication, you know. But you have these guys, right? They're the scions of a more powerful father. Trump's father, Fred Sr., had built a big empire. He knew who his son was. Fred Sr. had to lawyer up on his deathbed because he knew Trump was going to try to screw him out of his empire. And Trump ultimately did. When he died and he left all these properties to his children, Trump pressured all the other kids to sell it off in one lump sum, which they did. And it was like $738 million, which Trump then blew on his debts in his casinos. That's the dumbest business move ever, because he had these Fred Sr. had these properties all over the New York City metropolitan area. Like that's a cash cow. That's not something you sell. That's something that's going to be worth billions in perpetuity. You're going to make money off of that forever. You know, you just live off the dividends. But Trump is such a immediate gratification kind of screw up that he had to pressure his siblings and just sell it for one lump sum that he had then blown by the time he got The Apprentice. The reason he did The Apprentice is because he was broke. And then when NBC came along and gave him a paycheck, that's why he hired all the kids, because they were all broke. So the kids would come in and get a SAG, you know, contract out of the thing too. Like the whole family are a bunch of grifters. Not the whole family, the Trump clan, you know, and because Mary Trump's cool. But he screwed her over. You know, that's the kind of guy he is. He screwed over his nephew he was born with like all kinds of complications, and he cut off his health insurance just to spite him.
Cerebral palsy, the condition I have.
Exactly. You know,
So,
that's who he is. You know, both of his brothers were alcoholics. One of them just died this summer. He used it as a photo op. He hadn't talked to his brother in 30 years. And then he's here, let me go visit my brother in the hospital. Let me have my brother's body brought down to the White House. You know, the guy was the town drunk up in Millbrook. I'm not trying to speak ill of him, but he was a known sort of just fall down drunk guy who ultimately caught up with him and he died of it, you know, and Trump used that as an excuse. His own son is a drug addict. How many times do you see Don
Mm.
Jr. on the internet, coked out of his mind, his eyes barely open? That shows you the character of that family, that they would let him publicly do that without an intervention. He was dry for 10 years. Ivanka doesn't drink. Like, the genetics of addiction are all through that family. And I'm not judging it. I'm in recovery myself. It runs in the family like it's a disease, and you have to treat it as such. But they don't treat it. They don't care about each other in the way that most people do, because the head of the family is a psychopath. So, you talk.
Yeah, going back to the spending spree that he had during the 1980s when he bought his airline. Uh, he had the multiple casinos. I just watched an ESPN 30 for 30 that was called Small Potatoes, the USFL, and how it failed, and it talked about how Trump eventually purchased the New Jersey Generals, which is his connection to Herschel Walker and why he ended up being on The Apprentice. But what ultimately happened was the USFL had their season during the spring. Everybody knows typically football is played in the fall. Trump wanted to go head to head with the NFL in the fall so that he could claim that the NFL had a monopoly and de facto get an NFL team for free. If they settle, they'll merge and he'll get an NFL team for free. Ultimately, Trump did win the monopoly suit, but they only settled for $1. That
That's
was
right.
the con, was that all of these players who were making decent salaries with the USFL didn't have anything to back up, didn't have anything to fall back on as a result of that lawsuit.
Yep. That's Trump. He screws people out, out of their livelihoods and then moves on.
Yeah.
And his only interest was having that was like for his own ego. He's not a football fan. He's not a sports guy. He
No.
just wants to get, his face in on the action. He had a Rolling Stones concert at his casino in the 80s. I worked with the Stones later, much later in 2012. But in the 80s, they played one of his casinos, and they're very smart, savvy guys, the Rolling Stones and their management. So they said, whatever happens, like, we'll come and do the gig, but you're not involved in it. We don't want your name on the promos. Don't have a press conference and announce this. This isn't Trump presents the Rolling Stones. So what happens? It's time for the concert, and all of a sudden they get wind that Trump has called a press conference in one of his rooms, and he's in there like, I'm pleased to announce the Rolling Stones are playing. And Keith sent the boys, the crew, to go grab a bunch of wrenches and tire irons and stuff. And they walked in the room and were like, you need to cut it now. Like, cut the cameras now and get the hell out of here. Like, that's literally Trump. He'll screw you over right to your face or right behind your back. It doesn't matter. He's pathological that way. And back to the earlier theme about these sort of scions of these powerful men, Fred Trump, it wasn't like Fred Trump didn't know his son was a screw up. Fred Trump was a mobbed up, basically a guy who built buildings for the Genovese crime family, right? So, and that's why when Trump moved to Manhattan and tried to build his own, Trump Tower, which he did build, his dad said, that's not our territory.
Right.
That's the Gambinos. That's, Fat Tony Salerno. Like, we don't mess with that. There's a code in the five families that everybody gets their kind of territory and you stay within in the lanes. But Trump was so brash that he wanted to mess up, this good thing or draw more attention to his family than Fred, who kind of had a cushy thing. Nobody was turning over any rocks. He was cheating on his taxes. Fred was, he was double billing everybody. He'd raise the rent and charge you for a new boiler. And then he'd pad all the books with false invoices. Like, they were all criminals. And Trump sort of is like that kind of brash, loud criminal. So what happened was, he, by enabling somebody like that, you create problems for yourself. And you see it all throughout these guys that are in the headlines. You see Matt Gaetz, who was clearly a screw up. His dad knew that guy was a screw up probably by the second or third DUI that he had to get him out of when he was in college, right? You kind of get an indication that this dude is not going to it's not going to keep going well for this guy if I keep bailing him out. But they have this guy's last name and they want to pass something on to them. Don Gates was the head of the Florida Senate. He was a very powerful man, a very wealthy, crooked like Florida businessman himself. So they sort of hope beyond hope that these kids will, it'll work out if they just keep providing them with these opportunities. Matt Gaetz went to University of Florida, UFC or whatever, then went to William and Mary, got a law degree. That's the oldest law school in the country. Like, that's a good school. They get things based on daddy's money, and they get these opportunities, and then they just blow them. Matt Gaetz has done nothing as a state senator in Florida, nor as a congressman in the United States Congress. He's trolled people. That's what he does. He pulls out his phone and he sends a tweet that's going to get attention for himself. And on the side, he was sleeping with teenagers, and doing drugs and doing all this other crazy stuff, which is also something we learned this week. We learned that he was paying with all this stuff in Venmo, and they had even more Venmo. He paid for it ass. Here's $800 ass.
Well, the thing is, he even trolled Liz Cheney. Right. A Florida congressman flew to Wyoming to troll on another representative. Like, that's how petty this dude is. And one thing that I'll point out that just blows my mind about Trump and like his lack of self-confidence. One of the songs that I heard play before one of his rallies was Fortunate Son.
Right.
Are you serious? I mean, talk about hypocrisy, brother.
Exactly. Dodged the draft 5 times, got like 5 deferments. His dad owned the building that the podiatrist was in, who wrote him the bone spurs thing that ultimately got him out of the war. So his dad was like, I'm going to raise your rent unless you write, whatever the form is that my son has bone spurs. He's the epitome of a fortunate son, but he was able to manipulate people. The same people that sent their sons or went themselves to Vietnam lined up for hours to get in a rally and watch that guy wave a flag, right? Because he pushed all the right buttons. He also played Lee Greenwood at his rallies. I'm proud to be an American. That's the most hogwash kind of bullshit patriotism pablum ever. It's like all of modern country music is BS. I remember sitting on my front porch with my pickup truck, country style. Like, no, you don't. I've been to where you live. It's strip malls and Applebee's. There's no country left down there.
Well, the crazy.
And you listen to rap music. Like, you listen to Kid Rock. Let's be real. You're not sitting around listening to bluegrass.
Yeah, no, they're not. And I was gonna make a point, but now I lost it.
Do it. I'm sorry.
That's okay. One thing that I was gonna bring up, just because we're recording this today, with the shooting that happened in Indianapolis, I was thinking about my childhood, and the war on terror started when I was 6 years old. I'm gonna be removed from graduating college 4 years now in May. I'm 26 now. It's been going on for 20 years, this war on terror. We have an entire generation, my generation, growing up in trauma, in warfare. Like, that's all that we know at this point. Like, and, we value what the military does for us every day, but we can't even protect our own communities. Maybe there needs to be a shift in trying to domesticate our ability to kind of control society and try to right the ship here, with what's going on.
Well, we need to heal society,
and heal. Yeah, exactly.
9/11 changed a lot of things in this country, for good reason. It was a cataclysmic event. I was, I live in New York City. I was there when it happened. I wasn't down there that day. I was up in, I probably told you that story before, right? I turned down a job with Michael Jackson that weekend because I'd worked with him on the Thursday night before at the VMAs, and Michael was just a little too weird for me. So I was supposed to do a gig on Sunday and Monday night. It was like this Jackson family reunion, and he had Liza Minnelli and he had Marlon Brando and some other people booked, but we had no idea what he was going to do. Like, there was no script. Nobody had any idea what was going on. The gig itself turned out to be like a disaster where people started throwing stuff down on the stage because they're just sitting there for hours with nothing going on. And I kind of saw that coming. So I got out of the gig early, went upstate to this little cabin I had in Woodstock, New York at the time. And 9/11 happened that morning. And I happened to be outside of the city, but I was a resident down there. And, I had to come back when they let us come back in a few days. So Michael Jackson got me out of 9/11, by the way. And he had to rent a car with Liza Minnelli and Marlon Brando and drive back across the country in the days after 9/11 because there was no flights. So could you imagine being at a gas station in Kansas, and you're filling up your pickup truck and all of a sudden Michael Jackson gets out, and, fills
Yeah.
up his car, like with Liza Minnelli, who I know, and Marlon, who I've never met, but passed away. Who would have been the one of those three that I'd like to meet. But anyway, okay, so 9/11 changes this all. It also brought in this intense militarization. It brought in this like, us against them kind of thing, and this idea of the sheepdog, that there was these guys that were protectors, and they sort of began to view their fellow Americans suspiciously. Obviously, there was a lot of founded hate directed towards the Muslim community, but there's also this sort of like mass branding of the iconography. I never say that word right. Iconography iconography of militarized life, right? The Punisher stickers, the big pickup trucks. Like you see these pickup trucks now, it's like, the Ford Raptor, like what are you, Raptor, dude? As I say, you live in Parsippany, you work in customer service, man. You're on your way to Applebee's. Why do you need the jacked up pickup truck? But and these propaganda films, like the Clint Eastwood film about the sniper and stuff,
Right.
It was all this kind of macho protectorate kind of BS, because it was BS. The war we went to fight had nothing to do with 9/11. Dick Cheney used 9/11 to make some money for his old company, Halliburton Kellogg Brown Root. He saw it as a business opportunity. Saddam Hussein was Bush Sr.'s buddy before he wasn't. He was somebody we supported in Iraq's war with Iran. When it became convenient to go after Saddam Hussein, they went after him, but he had nothing to do with 9/11. Neither did Afghanistan. It was Saudi Arabians were there, but you can't touch Saudi Arabians because that's a cash cow. So the whole thing was just a money-making adventure, but they sucked up a generation of American youth in it. I have a cousin who served in Afghanistan. He was a Marine sniper and he served with honor, and I'm proud of him for doing that, but there was no reason to be there. And he went there and realized it was BS, like everybody does. I shouldn't say everybody does. Some people buy into it and they come home and they're just like, you did.
Well,
You go.
and American imperialism is a real thing, man. Like we're there to get the resources. It's an oil rich country. And the point I was going to make earlier when you were talking about that country song and how it's like overly American. If you're proud of your history, if you're like reading a history book and you're proud of it, you're probably not reading history. Like I'm watching this show, Exterminate the Brutes on HBO Max, and it talks about how Western Europe just, exploited resources and ended up, eliminating people in order to build their own empire. And in order to get the real story, we've talked about Howard Zinn and his book and the truth underneath all the problems that face society. You have to kind of look underneath things and between the lines in order to really understand it.
Absolutely. And they don't want you to really understand it. It's a lot easier to manipulate a people if you just feed them this sort of saccharine, like BS, wave a flag, light some fireworks off on the 4th of July, and don't look over here. Because we've done some messed up stuff as a country. And Howard Zinn is a great example of people's history of the United States. My grandfather, Harry Casler, was, naval intelligence in World War II. He was one of those guys like flying over Dresden, telling, in a B-12 bomber or whatever, telling them where to drop the bombs to make a cyclone of fire. That was a war crime. We killed women and children and civilians. It was, World War II, so it seemed justified, but it wasn't exactly like a kosher kind of thing to do. No pun intended. And, he did that kind of thing, was in the OSS, helped set up the CIA, became Nixon's envoy to Vietnam, was down there in Venezuela, was in Panama, was in Malaysia, as it was known at the time, like did all these things on behalf of our government, the things that you do in the shadows and don't really hear about, but you're doing it for the greater good. And he ended his career because he got in a fight with Kissinger over the bombing of Cambodia. And at that point, Nixon would only listen to Kissinger, who had sabotaged a peace deal in '68 in Paris that was bringing the two sides in Vietnam came to the table and were ready to end the war. And Kissinger was like, if you end the war now, Johnson or whoever he endorses is becoming president. Like, a Democrat will win this election if this war ends. So they made sure it didn't end. And then it didn't end till 1975. So how many tens of thousands of kids already died after that fact? But when they started bombing Cambodia, my grandfather was like, I've done a ton of really bad things for this country for the greater good, and now I see it sort of BS. And this was a hardline Cold War here, my grandfather. He was like no shrinking violet hippie, his kids were hippies. He hated it. This guy was like old school, capitalist. And Nixon only listened to Kissinger at that point because he was only concerned with his own political future, and allowed illegal bombing in Cambodia, where we just bombed villages for no good reason. And my grandfather left and moved his family to Ireland in protest and became an expatriate, would only come back to the country once a year at Christmas, and they'd stay in DC. But my point in that is, like, we do a lot of bad things as a country, and ultimately we'd always been led to believe they were for the greater good. In some cases, you could make an argument that they were. Trump was a different thing. Like, he didn't even hide it. He was just like, hey, you idiots, you didn't take the oil. Like, how did you do the Iraq war and not steal the oil? I'm stealing the oil now in Syria. And it's like, you can't do that. Like, that's pillaging, that's plundering. It's not yours to take. But that's how dumb a guy we elected, that he didn't know that kind of stuff happens in the shadows, or an American company profits from it, in behind the scenes. Trump was just like, I'm taking the oil. It was just rape and pillage, because that's how he behaves. And I mean, the Middle East itself was divided up on a map. The reason there's all those problems to begin with is what we did, and British, and and all these things. The modern world we live in, with all of its complications, are a direct result of sort of Western policies that benefit imperialistic impulses, whether that's the British Empire or the American Empire, which is sort of crumbling now. And now that's all coming home to roost, because there's no way to hide from it anymore. And it's harder and harder to say, like, we're the good guys. We're a nation of really good people, and we've done a lot of really good things in terms of technology and society, and culturally we're wonderful. We've always led the world, but it's scary now because we're not, it's hard to be like, respect us. The fact that, like, what came out yesterday, the proof of Konstantin Kilimnik, like, handing this off to Russia, and that everyone knew that was the case, but that, like, we let a guy do that for 4 years. And then 3 years into doing that, he turned his back on a pandemic because it didn't suit his political interests, and let 500,000 people perish, and we didn't lead the world. Now we're leading the world, I guess, in vaccinations, but we didn't provide leadership to the globe when that happened. We fractured, and we made it worse. And that's something, I think it'll be a long time before we're forgiven in the eyes of history and our allies for how we've behaved, not just last year, but in the last 4 years.
It is immeasurable, the amount of damage that he has done to not only our economy, but to the American psyche. I mean, part of the issue with COVID, not only are you stuck in your house for over a year's time, but you're also seeing on the news a guy like George Floyd, have a knee on his neck and be murdered on tape. We're all watching that. We're at home. That's part of the reason for the outrage, was that everybody was home watching TV, and it concerns me. We've talked about it before. Trump was pretty obvious with his criminality. He was out in front. If we elect a guy like Josh Hawley, who's much smoother and knows what he's doing, it's going to be a lot more subtle and just as impactful.
Well, that's the scary thing, is your Tom Cottons, your right. Ron DeSantis, who's basically like Trump with a law degree. Your exactly. Josh Hawleys, your outright white supremacist racists who want to grandstand. Tom Cotton is the one that gets to me the most. There's something just evil about that guy, and the way he grilled Kristen Clark, who clearly terrified him because she's somebody who was raised in Brooklyn by Jamaican parents who instilled in her hard work, right? She became part of a program in Brooklyn that would take inner city youth and give them opportunities to go to these prep schools in the suburbs, prep schools that pretty much guarantee you a place into an Ivy League if you do well there. So she went to Choate Rosemary Hall. That's where Ivanka Trump got her way bought into when she got kicked out of her Upper East Side Dalton, and or Chapin. I think she was at Chapin first. But anyway, so this girl goes, to where in their mind she doesn't belong, kicks butt, actually joined the boys wrestling team, which is just amazing and badass, right? Then goes to Harvard, then goes to Columbia, gets a law degree, and then starts suing every racist dude and every discriminatory policy that comes her way, right? She sued the Boy Scouts for anti-LGBTQ hiring practices. They wouldn't hire gay people. She sued the Proud Boys recently. Like, she's everything they fear because she's smarter than them. She's better than them. And she did it without their advantage. Part of this sort of like aristocracy of mediocrity that I touched on before, your Ron DeSantis, your Matt Gaetz and your Don Juniors and you're these people that are born on third base. Part of like how you protect that pipeline to letting, to passing on this generational wealth and privilege is that you keep others out of the schools and the country clubs that allow that access. So when somebody breaks through the ranks like a Kristen Clark does and then rises to not to the top of her schools, but to the top of government, to the top of attorneys generals in this country, it terrifies them because she's beholden to no one. These other guys are beholden to the people that helped them get there. Somebody like that, she doesn't answer to anybody and they know it.
Well, and one thing that I would pay pay-per-view for, I believe, I don't know if it was actually exchanged. I saw it on Twitter. Marjorie Taylor Greene debating
AOC.
AOC. Yeah, I would pay to see that. That would be wonderful to watch.
Yeah, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We got to say her whole name. She's a baller, man. She went to Yorktown High School. I went to Lakeland High School. It's the same town.
She's a powerful woman, man. I love her. She's fantastic. Also, Jim Jordan got yelled at this week. That was fantastic.
That was great. Maxine Waters. And that's the same thing I'm talking about. He's grandstanding. He's not doing that for any other thing than the soundbite, than the clip of me yelling at Dr. Fauci, a guy who went to Regis High School, which is, if you live in New York City, that's like the best of the best. I've talked about it before. It's a smart guy who went there. And obviously, head of the NIH, spent his whole life saving lives and researching medicine and vaccines, helped cure, there's no cure for AIDS, but helped tremendously bring AIDS, into some sort of like manageable situation. And here's Jim Jordan. I looked at a picture of Jim Jordan today. If you just looked at the guy's picture, like he's a moron, with his cauliflower ears and his goofy sideways grin, the guy is a villain in every sense, and he's making money off it. A report came out today that Josh Hawley made $600,000 in donation in the weeks after supporting the insurrection on January 6th. Yeah. All of these guys make a ton of money. Marjorie Taylor Greene is an idiot, and she just had a tweet today, an anti-trans tweet, which just gets under my skin. Because they try to equate it with this Christianity, and she's banging dudes in the in her gym, like sex Svengalis or whatever, she's shooting guns. Jesus doesn't want you having an AR-15 or 17 or whatever the hell they're called. I promise you that. But they know, hey, I can make a lot of money. Lauren Boebert didn't even have a high school degree. She dropped out of high school and went to work at McDonald's, which there's nothing wrong. People have to do that. But she just got her GED 2 years before she ran for Congress. She has no business being in Congress, but it doesn't matter in that party, because if you're loud and you're a troll, you're in, because we're not about legislating. If you're a GOP, you're about getting attention and raising money from the stupid people that support us. And we need you to talk about Jesus, guns, how great Trump is and the American flag as much as you can, be as xenophobic as you can, be as homophobic as you can, and there's room for you at the table. And we'll invite you to CPAC and we'll make some money. And if you're real good, we'll mention you on Fox News. And then you'll really get in the big leagues.
Well, and we know that the GOP is the entertainment wing. They elected Ronald Reagan, who was an actor before he became president.
Yeah.
Marjorie Taylor Greene, I talked with Corey Ryan Forster. He's a comedian on Twitter. She ran unopposed in Georgia. That's part of the problem. We need to have candidates that can go up against these idiots and prove that they're not worthy of the office they hold.
Well, she only ran unopposed because she moved into a district where they chased out the Democratic candidate.
Exactly.
So she moved into North Georgia, where she's not even from, to take an unopposed race and win it. And who knows what they did to the guy that dropped out of the race. That's the other thing, this QAnon stuff now. Like, they can go find out stuff on you and your family and come to you and be like, you're dropping out of that race, or we're dropping this info. That your dad cheated on your mom, or I'm just hypothetically, but who knows what it is, or maybe just like, what, I don't want to get harassed by QAnon nuts. I live in North Georgia. I don't want one of these idiots with an AR-15 chasing my kids when they come home from school. Like, so why bother? Public service, in its best, is not a high paying career. Mitch McConnell makes a lot of money at it, like, but
and he had the balls to say that companies should stay out of politics.
Exactly.
Really?
Yeah.
Dude, you're the guy that takes money from everybody.
Absolutely.
Seriously?
Absolutely. And his wife made a fortune in the Trump administration, as transportation secretary. She was just grifting left and right. And he was very, he was tied in with Deripaska and all this Russian money. So, but what they're counting on is their constituencies will not notice, because they're too busy, thinking that they're fighting the good fight. And the main thing, and we'll start to wrap up here, but the main thing about what happened with Kalimnik and the Russian interference is that they micro-targeted these people, right? As I've discussed before, Jared knew, like, we don't have to win the popular vote. We'll never win the popular vote, because most people, in the East Coast and the West Coast are going to vote for Hillary Clinton because they're smart. They don't buy this Christo-fascist BS. They don't care about the guns. They don't want guns, in their schools, and they're educated. So they're not going to buy an idiot 74-year-old in diapers with a spray tan and a girdle, sniffing his Adderall up his nostril, dancing around a YMCA. Like, that ain't gonna happen, right? So it can't be a fair fight, right? Flossing up there, So,
yeah, exactly.
And they knew Barack Obama won. He carried places that traditionally Republicans would carry. So we need to get those places back. So they found out, hey, who are these guys in Wisconsin that voted for Barack Obama, that work as pipe fitters in a factory or whatever, but also have a pickup truck and listen to Kid Rock and join the NRA. Like, those are our people. We can manipulate those people. And that's what they did. They took that polling data and showed where their strengths and weaknesses were, where they needed to flip votes in specific races to win the Electoral College, and they gave that to the Russians. And then the Russians turned around and just started on Facebook and all this stuff, hitting these people with cyber ops, with warfare, which is basically like, Hillary's a pedophile. She's got a pizza sex ring. She's going to take your guns, like, blah, blah, blah. And it works, because these housewives read it and they think it's real. They stumble upon it. Their friend sends it to them. It's designed to work on your emotions. So you're reading it, feeling like you're discovering it. You already don't really like, Hillary, because you've been told that she's bad for the last 20 years by Fox News and stuff, so you're already set against her and easy to manipulate. And then they just do it. And then comes this guy who you think is cool, that you don't really know much about beyond that he was on The Apprentice and he's a billionaire, with none of that was true. That was also a Russian manufactured thing. It was the Russians that told Mark Burnett to go to Trump and do The Apprentice. Mark Burnett went to Russia and wanted to do a reality show on the Mir space station and having it funded by oligarchs. And they were like, no, you need to go to New York City and do it on our boy Donald Trump. So that the whole thing was like whitewashing him in preparation of 2016. 2016 happens. They manipulate these people. and he wins the election. Even he was surprised that it worked. If you saw him on election night, he was shocked. You know, I got a buddy who was there, and like Trump was the last guy who thought he was going to win, right? But he
Mhm.
won. And then what did he do? He grifted. He grifted and stole. And after 4 years of that, a year of being locked down, of a guy literally telling you to inject bleach, and put ultraviolet light up your butt or something like that,
Mhm.
that might cure COVID, like just in crazy stuff. We're facing the biggest like disaster we've ever had as a nation. And the guy's sitting on the South Lawn of the White House with my pillow guy,
Right.
having a press conference. Like anybody who didn't see that and say, this is the worst thing that's ever happened. This guy can't be president another day. Not only did they not say that, 74 million people voted for him in November after a year of that. So it shows you how effective Bill Barr was in getting ahead of the Mueller report. It shows you how effective the Russia hoax is. And more importantly, it shows you how dangerous a tool and how powerful a weapon Facebook and social media and this stuff is. And it's not over anytime soon. We're just at the beginning of this.
Yeah, and to some degree, I mean, I hate to blame the American people that voted for Trump, but at some point, you got to take a step back and say, am I being ignorant here? Like, you got to look at it from a bird's eye view, and it's unfortunate that there's been such a lack of education when it comes to verifying sources. And we've talked about how the 24-hour news cycle just ate the Trump stuff up because they knew he was a cash cow too, you know?
Absolutely. And that's what happened in 2015, when they were having these, the first series of debates where Trump was calling Megyn Kelly, saying, oh, she's on her period or whatever. Like that turned into ratings gold in the middle of the summer. Normally a Republican debate would not be like a big ticket like ratings bonanza in July, right? But these things became super ratings gold because people were tuning in. It became a reality show. What's he going to say next? Oh my God, he said little Marco. Look at this guy. He's crazy. And people liked that. The people that liked him, that don't really understand politics, that aren't sophisticated, that don't want to hear these long policy wonk answers, were like, oh, he's just like me. Like he's funny and he's bullying that guy. And he says he loves America. And I think his wife's hot. He's got my vote, you know?
Right. And the thing that I think it was Jim Jeffries, I love him as a comedian. He said, just because Trump says words that you understand, that doesn't make it smart, like expand your horizons, folks. Get outside of your bubble that you're in. There is a world out there, and you got to try to get as many experiences as you can because that's how you develop empathy.
I know, but that's why they go after arts. That's why back to Reagan. That's why he started cutting funding for the arts. You don't want a deeply humanized populace because they're going to find empathy for their fellow man and they're going to expand their ability to feel empathy and they're going to understand under other cultures and they're not going to fear them. So it's going to be a lot easier to a lot harder to manipulate somebody who's not scared of Mexicans coming in here, who's going to say they're not coming to take our jobs. They're coming here to work jobs that we don't want to work. And they're coming here to bring their culture, which I now appreciate even more because I just learned about it, and I want some of that flavor. That's the best thing about America. Like the reason I live in New York City is because you have every culture there. I don't want to eat fried chicken and Chick-fil-A and like whatever. No offense, but like when I go to Indiana, I'm like, damn, like it's steak and a salad bar, wherever you go. You know what I'm saying? Like that's just most of this country is very homogenized, and that's a result of that. And there's pockets there's pockets of good stuff everywhere, but and that makes it richer. That's better. You want spices, you want flavor, but they don't want people having that. They want you not only not having it, they want you fearing that. So you cut the arts, you cut public education. You make it harder to go to school. So again, only the elitists get to go to school.
Exactly.
Ron DeSantis is not a smart guy, but he's had the opportunities. Matt Gaetz is a bonehead, but he's had the opportunities. He has the degrees you're not going to get. If you want to do something, you can go join the army. You can go join the police force. Not that those aren't noble causes or can be at their best. We got a real issue with policing now. But and with the army, as we saw with this guy who was attacking this young African American man on the street, who luckily got driven out of his neighborhood last night and arrested. But my point is, they want a certain type of easily manipulated person in this country because that guy's going to vote for them and allow them to grift and steal. And that's a good place to end it this week. I've been talking for about an hour and you've been making some insightful comments. So why don't you take the last insightful comment, Jimmy?
I'll just wrap it up by saying if you're a competent, empathetic, and courageous person, you have nothing to worry about when it comes to these immigrants. You know, they're only going to help you. They're only going to help this country. And there's nothing to be afraid of. They're only people just like you and me.
Absolutely. And stop the violence. I'm sorry. Tomorrow, you guys are in shock in Indianapolis. It'll be a tough weekend as these stories start to come out, because those 8 people aren't just the latest figures. Those are 8 people that lived lives, that were going to work, that have families, that God forbid have children that are never going to see their parents again. All for what? So the NRA can sell rifles. So some aggrieved person can do a mistake that he can, not a mistake, a vicious, horrible crime that somehow people find themselves willing to do in this nation. Other nations, they don't do that. It's not just because of the gun controls. Like, they don't snap and decide they're going to kill everybody. Sometimes it happens, but it happens here all the time. It's become a viable choice, and that has to end. That has to stop. And maybe next week, we can talk about the disparity of how they treat the people that do this stuff. Because if you're a white guy and you do a mass shooting, like down in South Carolina when the kid shot up the African American church, they brought him to Burger King. The cops brought him to Burger King. Kyle Rittenhouse, they handed him a bottle of water and told him to go home. He had an AR-15 slung over his shoulder and he had just shot 2 people. When it was time for him to go to jail, the cops who knew him came and got him, right? Mm-hmm. Black kid, put your hands up. Boom, you're dead. Sorry, I thought you might have had a gun.
Well, and they have an entire system that allows them to escape, without criminality. Part of the issue with bad policing is that we have to have the good apples show up. Where are those guys? We need those people to show up now.
Yeah, and we got into that with my buddy Nick, so that's going to be a special episode I'm going to put on YouTube, and you get to hear Nick's thoughts on policing. And that's it for the week. That's episode 7. It's been an exhausting week. So get some rest, because when you hear this, it's going to be Monday and we're going to have another week ahead. But thanks for everybody for listening. This podcast is really starting to take off, and we appreciate your support and we appreciate you listening, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.